Good afternoon, or should I say good evening? I'm a minister, and I don't get to, during the worship service, to break through and say this again, but I'm going to say good evening, and I want that full voice coming back at me. Good evening. Okay. I am Dwayne Davis, lead minister here at Plymouth Church, and I am so grateful to see this many of our citizens join us for this Civic Buzz Town Hall. I just want to start off by thanking the sponsors of this event, the League of Women Voters, Mill City Commons, and our own Reimagining Community Safety Committee. I am so grateful to them for having the foresight, the vision, and the planning to bring us together to have a conversation with our police chief. So I do want to thank them for bringing us together. I want to thank you for coming here, and I want to thank our Minneapolis Chief of Police, Brian O'Hara, for joining us for this conversation and putting himself right out here for questions from the people. And that's important, for us. I want to thank Ellen Iwarden for hosting this to me and for moderating this and for putting me, telling me where I need to go. It's always important for people to put you in your right space, and so I am glad we're doing that. Members of the Reimagining Community Safety Committee here at Plymouth came together after the murder of George Floyd as a way to actively engage communities, public officials, activists, and communities of faith in a broad, imaginative conversation about how to make a community safety policy and practice that serves and respects all people in Minneapolis, all people, not just white citizens, not just the wealthy citizens, and that when we have a situation like the murder of George Floyd, that is an indication that our community has failed, not one set of the community, not other communities, but Minneapolis has failed. And when I joined this congregation, I was overjoyed to know and very impressed that we had a group of people who were going to have tough conversations, uncomfortable conversations, and ongoing conversations about what we can do to make our communities safe. So Chief O'Hara comes to service at a critical time in our city. Our racial divisions and racial disparities, the recent enforceable settlement agreement with the Department of Human Rights and the city of Minneapolis, the actual and perceived increases in crime, and a police department that is stretched to the breaking point, all converge to land right in your lap, sir. And it is going to require creative and imaginative vision and leadership. And so, Chief, we know how profound the challenges are that you have before you. And I think the first time the Chief visited this congregation in the worship service, I told him that we are going to work with him however we can. And we're also going to be there wagging our finger when we need to. That is the responsibility of people who want to do good work. And so even here, we at Plymouth find ourselves thrust headlong into the cross-cutting cleavages of our own commitments to social justice, our concerns about personal safety, and our diverse and competing political commitments and ideological perspectives. And yes, Plymouth people know how to fight. But our commitment is to hash it out, to do good work and serve our communities. And I want to point out to you, and I wanted the chief to hear me say it, one of the unexpected operational challenge that I have encountered here is that the fastest growing unbudgeted item that we as a church have had to absorb has been security. Due to the increase in violence, property theft, and assault. But we also recognize that we need our police, and we need the trust of our neighbors, and we need to be a welcoming and open neighbor here in this community. And so we stand committed to working with the chief, with activists, and with our neighbors to imagine a community safety response that is just, equitable, compassionate, and effective. And I pray that tonight's conversation will carry us very far in that goal. So welcome, and thank you for doing it. Ellen, it's up to you now.
Thank you, Dwayne. Welcome to Civic Buzz, a program of the League of Women Voters Minneapolis. I'm Ellen Van Iwarden, the League's program director, and I'm glad you've joined us tonight. Our mission at the League is to encourage informed and active participation at all levels of government. As a nonpartisan organization, we work to increase understanding of major policy issues and influence public policy through education and advocacy. We do meaningful work and have been doing so for over 100 years. Please join us. You can find out more at our information table on your way out tonight or at our website, lwvmpls.org. In addition to the League, tonight's program is also sponsored, as you heard from Dwayne, by two co-sponsors, and we're very grateful to Plymouth's Reimagining Community Safety Committee and Mill City Commons. Tonight, I'm honored to introduce Minneapolis Police Chief Brian O'Hara, who was sworn in as the 59th Chief of the Minneapolis Police Department on November 7th, 2022. O'Hara joined Minneapolis after previously serving as deputy mayor of the city of Newark. His focus there was on strategic initiatives relating to policing and public safety. He had been Newark's public safety director, overseeing almost 2,000 employees, including 996 sworn police officers, 611 firefighters, and 346 civilian employees. He began his law enforcement career in 2001, joining the Newark Police Department and rising through the ranks to become a captain in 2016. And as captain of the Newark Police Department's Consent Decree and Planning Division, O'Hara worked with the Department of Justice on the 2016 Consent Decree between the U.S. and the city of Newark. O'Hara facilitated the implementation, monitoring, and compliance of all consent decree requirements designed to shift the Newark Police Department culture. He was promoted there to Deputy Chief of Accountability. He holds bachelor's and master's degrees from Rutgers University, and he's married and the father of 2 boys. Tonight, Chief O'Hara is joined by the Police Chief of Staff, Christopher Gaynor, and Inspector Katie Backwell. Thank you all for joining us. And so after the chief speaks, we'll have plenty of time for questions. If you need a card to write a question, we still have more. And if you need to turn in a card with a question, just raise your hand and we have volunteers to collect them. And with that, I will turn it over to Chief O'Hara. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Pastor, for having me back here. Pastor mentioned, I first came to Minneapolis in October is when I moved here. I became the police chief on November 7th, but there was a time period going through the process where I was just trying to get around and meet folks in community and be different places, and I was invited and welcomed to come here and worship on Sunday, and so thank you, Pastor, and to members of the congregation here. And I tell you, as an outsider, is what I tell everybody, you know, Minneapolis has been incredibly welcoming to me, and that's all different communities, all different neighborhoods around the city, over on the north side, different neighborhoods on the south side, Somali community and recent immigrant communities. People here have been incredibly welcoming to me and very loving, so thank you very much for having me. As was mentioned, I'm from Newark, New Jersey. I have a lot of experience working with the federal government and implementing a federal consent decree in Newark. And while Newark and Minneapolis are quite different as cities, there's some important aspects that are very similar. One, Newark struggled for decades with some very, very difficult and bad relations between police and community. Particularly from, you know, what everyone thinks of Newark from the 1967 rebellion, and dozens of people were killed during that, and it was all started because of an arrest of a cab driver by a police officer. That's the scars of that the city still deals with today. But that is the epitome of the poor relationships that historically had been had by Newark's police officers and community. And in the same, the other thing that's an issue in Minneapolis that's very similar to what Newark's experience has been is just the issue of gun violence and serious street crime. And it's no secret, the last 2 or 3 years here, Minneapolis has struggled with violent crime, and in particular gun violence. So I know when, as polarized as we are as a society, you know, you can listen to what people say and the comments people make online, and a lot of folks think that, you know, when crime and violence is high, the only thing you can do is sort of unleash the cops and let them do whatever. And then on the other side, people say, well, you know, you have to protect people's civil rights. And I'm here to say that the only thing that we can possibly do is to try and do both at the same time. And that's what we have seen, you know, work in Newark and in other cities. And I think that's what we're starting to see happen here. You know, it's no secret the last couple years here have been the most challenging in a generation for people who live in our community, especially in terms of serious street crime. And in no way are we, you know, out of the trouble or ready to do a victory lap, but I am very thankful to stand here today and to tell you that 46 fewer families in this city have had someone in their family shot in Minneapolis this year. There's been 46 fewer people shot in Minneapolis year to date. That's incredible. That's important. In the same sense, there's been over 40% decline in carjackings, which is the taking of a car by violence, by pointing a gun and that type of thing. There's been a decline in the amount of shots fired in the city. There's a decline. There's fewer people who've been murdered this year in Minneapolis. And these things are all happening at a time while the city has struggled with police staffing. You would have to go back to, essentially, you'd have to go back to the 60s when Kennedy was president to get the level of staffing of police officers that we have today. And at the same time, the police officers in Minneapolis today have already this year recovered more guns year to date off of the streets here than ever before. So I know, we all know that we have lost hundreds of police officers in the city over the last 3 years, but I am very thankful to say that the people that we do have here, I think, are very resilient. They, like our residents, have been through so much, but I think there's a very, like many of our residents, there's just a very strong desire to have progress, to have some sense of direction going forward, and to move forward together so that we can earn people's trust as we do our work, but also that we can respond and be present in ways that we hadn't been before to ensure that we have fewer and fewer victims of serious street crime and violence. That being said, we still have enormous challenges ahead. We have moments, we have days where we just have truly just an unacceptable amount of bad things happening on our street. but we are responding to that. We're working in new ways and we're working differently, and I'm really thankful to say we have an incredible amount of support from other law enforcement partners. As we're standing here in this absolutely beautiful sacred space today, I'm sure many of you know that last week we had 2 houses of worship that were attacked in our city. Our Muslim neighbors, 2 different incidents while folks were gathered in a sacred space, much like we are, while they were praying. Someone came in while people were praying, while families and children were present, and lit fire to the building. But I can tell you that thanks to the strong partnerships that we have with our U.S. Attorney, I was meeting with the U.S. Attorney talking about the first incident when I heard of the second fire. And that night we were able to get the FBI, the ATF, an assistant U.S. attorney on the phone, and a very strong response that I think we have seen. We were able to take this person off the street and bring them to justice. And any type of crime that we have is important, particularly those that threaten violence and so on. But there certainly is something particularly egregious about attacking a house of worship with so many people inside, and any type of crime that is motivated by hate or bias or intolerance is just absolutely unacceptable. And so between that and I think there's some things I can say, some things I can't say. If you watch the news tomorrow night, you'll be seeing some other work that we've been doing this week that I think will have a very real impact on trying to keep people safe this summer. So I'm thankful for the partnerships that we have. I think the overall vision, the overall strategy that we're trying to bring forward is we need to be focused precisely as possible with all of our law enforcement resources on getting at that less than 1% of folks that are out here pulling triggers, that are committing serious street crime and robberies, and getting them off the street as quickly as possible. And I'm very thankful that we've had a lot of buy-in from all of law enforcement, but also from a number of our community-based violence prevention and organizations as well. Because we have a lot of folks that are out here that are willing to partner with us to walk the streets and to try and talk to people to help prevent things from happening. The reality about, particularly with gun violence, the vast majority of shootings in Minneapolis are just like shootings in cities around the country. They happen because we have too many guns in circulation that people who should not have them have access to them, and then some minor conflict happens and somebody's pulling out a gun to resolve literally just some nonsense. I mean, it's insane that's the cost to society of really just some utter nonsense. But that's why I'm very thankful for a lot of the community-based groups that we have. They're willing to go out there to try and provide some sense of conflict resolution with some of our young people that are engaged in some of this life out there, because we need that. I'm not looking to send everyone to federal prison for 30 years. I'm not. But I will do that. I will do everything I can if some people are out here engaged, causing real harm. Because I think the reality is, our most vulnerable communities in this city are the ones, like other cities, are the ones that experience the brunt of not only policing and law enforcement, but they experience the worst of gun violence and those types of crimes. So I am all about ensuring that if there are people that we cannot, prevent things from happening, that are out here causing serious harm, that we need to be doing everything that we can to get them off the street and out of the community so that they cannot traumatize our neighborhoods and destroy our neighbors and people's lives. So those are some of the things, I guess, broadly that I think of in terms of law enforcement. And I guess I don't know what's best to open it up for questions or, okay. Okay, thank you. I don't want to talk too much. Okay. So the first one is, you You talk a lot about how you want Minneapolis police to conduct constitutional policing. What is constitutional policing? So the strict definition would be policing that is performed, in accordance with, in particular, our Bill of Rights under the Constitution. That's policing that is done, I think, the biggest things that we could think about, where stops, searches, arrests, the use of force, all those things are done in accordance with the standards set by the Constitution. But I think it goes deeper than that. I think on a most basic sense, people want good policing. They want policing that when officers are present, they are respectful. When officers show up, that they police and are present in a way that earns people's trust. The largest complaint that you will see in any law enforcement agency, is not, the most egregious things that we see on videos when they hit the news. The most destruction to a police department, the most common thing that happens is officers showing up and simply being rude, simply being disrespectful when engaging community, simply acting in ways, that body language and other things that we do that is, if nothing else, is at least perceived as caring less than, if not the community in general, certain people within communities. So to me, constitutional policing is doing all those things that are legal and just, but it's more than that. It's ensuring that we reward behavior when officers are behaving in ways that reflect community values, and that we hold officers accountable quickly when officers' behavior is less than what the community expects. And community expects and deserves good policing that is effective at addressing, and reducing the amount of victims that we have in community, but is also effective at engaging in ways and doing our job in ways that helps build trust. So, The police contract. In the upcoming negotiations with the Police Federation, what are 2 or 3 priorities? So I think, I know, the city is engaged in a petition with the Bureau of Mediation Services, and that petition, there's an effort to split the union so that officers are in one union and then supervisors are in a different union. So with that court action going on, I am limited on what I can say because the city and me are not allowed to engage in anything with negotiations, like things have to maintain status quo. So without getting into specifics, I can tell you just generally opinions that hopefully won't get me in trouble. One thing I can say is I know that there's a lot of attention on the police union contract as if the union did something unilaterally. We have to remember that this is a situation we got into over decades, and the city agreed to all this stuff. The union did not unilaterally create this contract. The city voluntarily agreed to a lot of this stuff. So this contract here is very long in terms of just the length of it and what I'm familiar with in other contracts in the past. And there are certain benefits and things in there that officers have that the city has given to the union. So, I think in general, going forward, I think we should try to, as best I could say, gain more managerial prerogative, because a lot of that, I think, has gone away. But beyond that, I honestly don't know if I've already said too much that the city attorneys will be upset with me tomorrow. I don't know. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. So off-duty work. What is your opinion on off-duty work for MPD officers? Where do the policies stand now? Will it depend on what can be negotiated in the contract? Yes. So there's like a court order, I think, from sometime in the early 90s, that there was some attempt by the city to change some of the parameters with off-duty work. And the city agreed to maintain the status quo. And anything to change that would have to be negotiated with the union. So We have the union contract, which has all this stuff in it, and then in addition to the union contract, we have other, what I would call side letter agreements. We have all these other agreements that affects police employment that are not in the contract, but the city also agreed to those. So it's a lot. And yes, this is definitely, off-duty work is definitely affected by it. The policies stand now, so the policies that limit the amount of overtime and the amount of hours total that police officers can work, that applies to both, city overtime and off-duty work. So those types of policies are the same, but the way it works now is, individual officers can essentially, they have to be in good standing and, not be allowed to work off-duty work, but they can work directly for various employers. It's not work that goes through the city. And where I come from, that's different from what I'm used to. Yeah. So Minneapolis has struggled with community police oversight for decades. What do you think the community's role is in police oversight, and how hopeful are you about the Community Commission on Police Oversight will be effective, transparent, and accountable? So, the problem that I see with police discipline in this city is, one, the community has, from what I've seen, no faith in the legitimacy of the system. People don't trust that the system works, that it's effective, and so on. And then internally in the police department, the cops don't think it's legitimate either. It's like the worst of both worlds. I think it takes way too long. I'm sure part of the reason why we have such a backlog is simply everything that has happened over the last 2 years and a number of complaints and things that have happened as a result of both the state investigation and all of the civil unrest and that type of thing. But what I would like to see, and it's very complicated because there's state law that sets sort of the guardrails for this stuff moving forward. So like, for example, discipline does not actually get implemented until it's final. And it's final after it's done with the grievance process. That's set by the state. So I just like when we're dealing with, bad behavior and people on the street, we need to be able to hold people accountable relatively close in time to when the bad behavior occurs. We don't need the death penalty for everything, but we do need to be able to have a consequence some close in time to when bad behavior occurs. And just with the totality of circumstances with the situation, it's frustrating because it takes way too long under the current setup. And like I said, there's lots of reasons for that. I am hopeful that there are a number of changes underway internally with the city. They're adding additional investigators in the civilian oversight entity. But I do think that there's still some structural issues that need to change. Like, we need to be able to, for example, just like if anyone has experience or any knowledge with how the court system works, the criminal courts, if everyone the police arrested said, nope, I'm not pleading guilty, I want to go to trial, the system would cease to work. There aren't enough judges, there aren't enough juries, like this just would not work. But this is basically the setup we have internally with discipline. There's no incentive for people to just admit that they've done something wrong and plead guilty and say, I'm not going to grieve this. I will plead guilty. I will say I did this. I admit to it, whatever. I'll take the consequence. I'll plead guilty. And that's kind of like an inherent flaw that I see. And I'm hopeful that in some way, we'll be able to encourage some more of that so that we can sort of lessen the entire burden in the system. But if we have a system that just takes too long, I don't think the community is going to think it's legitimate, and the cops are still going to think it's not legitimate either. The original question, the original point about police oversight, There's lots of different systems, and there's just a lot of academic research about that issue. My personal opinion, I do think it is effective to have sort of an independent monitor, which is something that cities get, when they have consent decrees and those types of agreements. But I do think in general, something that has shown to be effective is the ability for some independent entity to come in and look at the entire process, look at the investigations, look at the discipline, look at everything after the fact, and not be responsible for actually doing the work of some of it. So like this independent entity we have here is going to do all of the investigations now. What I'm saying is I do think it's better to have something totally independent of doing the work that can look at it and say, maybe your investigations aren't that thorough, and that's why you're losing some of these, like that kind of thing. Like, I do think it would be helpful to have some purely independent entity that could look at the whole process and say what I'm doing, what the civilian investigations are doing, those kinds of things, and actually have some answer for the whole process. But just in general, I think it just takes too long, and at least at this point, I don't think that community's happy with it, and I don't think the police are happy with it either.
Just a follow-up question. On the issue of there not being incentives to not grieve, were there incentives in Newark?
Yes. Yeah.
What were they?
Sure. So I had more of an ability to move things along quicker in the process. I was able to, I was able to change charges and, offer what we would call a lesser included offense, and have the union agree to it. I was able to send things to a commanding officer. So, if it was minor discipline, and by minor discipline, the way it was defined in New Jersey and New York and other places, 5 days suspension or less. So if the maximum penalty an officer could get would be, a verbal reprimand or retraining, but suspension up to 5 days, I had the ability to send that to an officer's commanding officer and have them deal with it. Because just the thinking is, like Inspector Blackwell, she knows all of her individual officers better than I do. She works with them every single day. She sort of knows who's who. She knows her supervisors who could get direct information. She is in a better position to deal with minor discipline more quickly than I could, because I have to deal with the whole department. So that's one thing that's different. It's my understanding that Minneapolis used to have the ability to do that years ago. I don't know if that's true. But just between that and if sort of the balance wasn't such that we know all we have to do is not agree to everything and just grieve it, and it'll take forever, and we'll probably win anyway. Like those types of structural things, the balance of power is sort of off. It does not encourage, accountability as best we can.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So what strategies are being pursued to attract and hire police recruits? So Deputy Chief Gators here actually oversees our recruitment efforts as well as a number of others. I can tell you we are seeing an increase now in applications. We are seeing an increase when people come in and they speak to Chief Gators, they speak to some of our command staff. People are having some sense that things are changing in Minneapolis, and that's largely just from word of mouth. I believe we have, some 24 police officers from within Minnesota that have applied to just transfer to Minneapolis, which is positive because that's a whole lot less time to train them and to get them on the street. One thing I've done, and I've been pursuing at the legislature, is just some legislative changes to help us. As an outsider coming here, I can tell you this has to be one of the most difficult states in the country to become a police officer. And it may have been set up like that for a reason. I had a woman came to me a couple months ago. She's mid-career professional from North Minneapolis her whole life. She worked for a number of years as a parole officer, has a bachelor's degree in psychology, but she's a single parent, so she can't go back, take time off, and go back to community college to take several months of classes that are required before she can even then go in the police academy. So she works for me now as a civilian employee, but she wanted to be a police officer. And that's the type of person I want to be a cop in Minneapolis. But just structurally, the way some of this stuff is set up, it's keeping a lot of people out. And I think we have to, I talked to a number of legislators, about this. I think we have to recognize that life has changed, and yeah, aside from all of the other things that are very obvious, that we have policing in general is struggling to attract candidates across the country, but this shirt in particular was on my TV in Newark, New Jersey every day for months, just like it was on everyone else's TV around the world. So this police department in particular has a very negative perception. And I think we have to be doing everything that we can to attract people with different skills, different backgrounds, people who particularly are from Minneapolis, who care about our community, who want to be a part of changing things for the better and helping them become members of the police department. The way these things are set up here, like you could come to me as a graduate of the law school here at the University of Minnesota or St. Thomas. I can't hire you to be a police officer. That's ridiculous. It's set up that the only folks who can are people who've been through like the 2-year community college program, or they've gone through, they call it a skills training, a series of community college classes. Before then I can put them in the police academy. So we have legislation to try and change some of that, to try and help particularly mid-career folks to become police officers. There's a bill a representative has in the House right now that anyone who has a bachelor's degree could go to an accelerated program where I could immediately then put them in the police academy, so they wouldn't have to take a year off. So that's one of the things that we're doing to try and help, particularly to get a diversity of experiences of people instead of relying on sort of just the traditional route. The other thing that we're doing, Deputy Chief Gators is the lead on, is just some programs to help encourage young people from our community to go to the police programs and to work for us while they're doing it. So we will pay for our young people's 2-year college and give them a job during that, and then put them in the police academy after. So we have had some success with that, but it is just a very long process going through that traditional route to become police officers. But I mean, the main thing for me that I hound Deputy Chief Gators all the time about is we want more people from the city to get on the police department. If we do have money and scholarships and things, we need to be getting that out as much as possible to our kids, the young people who live here, who will hopefully be more likely to have more love for community, more respect for community, and more of a desire to really have some sense of progress here. So what is your plan for dealing with citizens who have mental health issues? How will police be trained to de-escalate confrontations? There is a really great program that has started here. It is contracted through a vendor, Canopy, I believe, is the vendor that the city uses for behavioral health care response. And it's my understanding how this has evolved that there was a lot of resistance from Minneapolis police as the city was trying to roll this out. And they're folks who are mental health professionals who respond with police or respond on their own instead of police to behavioral health emergencies in the city. And I can tell you, all the conversations I've had since this thing now is up and running, the cops absolutely love it because they are incredibly effective. They're very good. And I have gotten complaints. There's been a couple of times in the beginning when I was here that, their vehicle was broken and they were, we can't have this. We need them out there. And That's fantastic because I can imagine, I know how these things work. There was a lot of resistance internally from police when this first started, but I think this is definitely something that's going to prove one of the best in the country as far as dealing with mental health. And I can tell you, just from my experience, there is a very large proportion, there's huge demand for calls for service for people with mental health emergencies here. So there's certainly no shortage of work. And then in addition to that related issue, we are in the process of hiring social workers that'll be embedded in our police precincts, all of them. So they will be able to help with a number of issues. Some of them may relate to mental health, some of them with substance abuse and other issues. But that'll just be another resource that will work in support of the work that officers are doing. Beyond that, there is a study that the city has that is going on to determine, to see if there are other, other calls for service that are not law enforcement related that could be sort of farmed out to some other entity. But yeah, in particular with mental health and behavioral health emergencies, there's this contract with Canopy and the work that it is being done, I think will be a model for the rest of the country. It is very effective, yeah. Juvenile justice. We've seen an increase in juvenile crime, from homicides to carjackings to theft. What are the best practices or most promising models for addressing this issue? This is on my mind every day. I told you before, carjackings almost cut in half, 46 fewer people shot this year, fewer shots fired, fewer robberies. Violent crime across the board is very significant decline year to date. We have an outrageous problem with auto theft, and that is driven almost entirely by juveniles. And the problem is that this has been going on since the summer of last year. It is an exponential increase in juvenile involvement in joyriding and stealing cars than what had happened before, literally exponential. And the problem is we are not holding young people accountable for their actions. And what we are doing as a society is we are failing these kids. This is happening in real time right now. And it is a struggle for me every day. It's something I talk to everyone about that will listen. I've only been the police chief here since November 7th. But I'm very engaged. I read all the reports every day. And I respond to scenes. I go to every homicide in the city. I've been at other critical incidents. And I can tell you what is happening out there isn't just the juveniles being involved in crime. It's because we're having juveniles, for example, a 15-year-old girl that so far this year, we already had her 10 times in a stolen car. 10 times. She has been in a coma for the last 2 weeks because she was in an accident in a stolen car. That is predictable. The Minneapolis police had her 10 times this year in a stolen car. It is entirely predictable that she would be either seriously injured, something would happen to her, or she would be involved in something more serious to someone else. 2 weeks before that, an 11-year-old boy in a stolen car, intubated, seriously injured. I've had a 12-year-old boy in these stolen cars running in between, running from the police, being taken into custody, shot 2 different times, 12 years old, while riding around in a stolen car. 14-year-old boy, dead after he crashed his car on Lyndale Avenue, wrapped it around a telephone pole in December, and died a couple of weeks later. A 15-year-old, I went to the scene on DuPont Avenue, driving around in a stolen car, shot. Because it starts with the joyriding, and then even when we take them into custody, they learn there's no consequence. They learn there's no accountability. These kids are almost universally immediately released. Sometimes if they're driving the car, they're given like one of these ankle bracelets. But they quickly learn they can just cut the bracelet off and continue their bad behavior. So what is happening, some of these kids are literally dying. Some of them are getting involved in very serious car accidents. And some other ones are learning, since there's no consequence, they're getting involved in more serious crime. They're running around in South Minneapolis like they were this weekend, committing robberies and things like that. And I am just very concerned that we are taking them into custody, immediately releasing them. We are teaching them, go ahead and keep doing what you're doing. We are providing negative reinforcement. And just to explain the scale of what I'm talking about, this has started because of social media. These TikTok videos that are out there that teach these kids how to steal Kias and Hyundais. Kias and Hyundais today, I mean, they fixed this thing, I think, from this year on. But Kias and Hyundais, the vast majority that are out there, you could steal those cars like it's 1985 again. All of the basic, ignition locking devices and engine locks that are standard in every other car in this country are not standard in those cars. So social media has exploited that. It became viral with a lot of these kids, and they learned you can steal these cars in under 60 seconds. And then they learn that when they go out here and they joyride and they do these things, that there's no accountability over their actions. So it is a real problem. To tell you, again, just to put it in perspective, this year, 9 out of the top 10 of all makes and models of cars that are stolen in the entire state are Kias and Hyundais. In Minneapolis, 2019, 2020, there was somewhere around 220 Kias and Hyundais stolen in an entire year. We have almost that many stolen in 1 week right now. That's how bad this is. And just, it's really, I mean, people look at it as sort of just a property crime, whatever. I mean, a lot of the folks where these cars are stolen, they can't afford to go then pay the impound, to pay to get their cars back, to pay to get the car fixed. They need their car to get to work. And just, again, by not having accountability, these kids are, again and again, doing these things, putting themselves at risk, putting their lives at risk, and putting everyone else's life on the street at risk. And they're, unfortunately, getting involved in more and more serious crime. And just because, again, we have so many guns out there, we're starting to see more and more of the relationship between the stolen cars and the guns, and now robberies and things like that. So the juvenile issue is a crisis right now. And it's just, I'm doing everything I can to get people's attention to this issue, because we need more than just police to deal with this. It's really, it's not good, the situation that we're in. And then there is just a lack of available resources and services to deal with these kids. We've had situations where literally mom or grandma is saying to the cop, I need help. I can't deal with my kid. Please take, and there's nothing we can do. No, it's just, there's nothing we can do. The kid's not being charged. And I just think it's showing a real failure on all of our part as a society, like to have a problem like this at the scale that we're having it and things not being addressed. Now, there's things that are happening. The legislature has some bills moving forward that require some things. Our attorney general is suing these manufacturers, calling for a recall. Look, to me, it's on the scope, it's on the level of a problem that, if this was happening, frankly, if this was happening to other kids elsewhere at the rate that it's happening here, I think there already would have been a mandatory recall, quite frankly, because it is a problem that is that serious. And we really need to be doing everything that we possibly can to try and get it under control. Yeah. Yes.
What other approaches would you have?
Yeah. So she mentioned the idea of a recall. What other approaches? So we have our inspectors, all the precincts, our officers have a couple hundred of the ignition, we used to call it the club. That's a brand name, the ignition locking devices. So we have folks out in community giving those away to people who would need them for those particular cars. Obviously encouraging some of the standard crime prevention tips, to ensure your car is secured and If you are able to, park in a garage, those types of things. But we really, aside from the recall, we need to be doing everything that we possibly can to try and address this problem. And that means, we're trying to find ways to connect some of these kids with services. And it's not like how some of this stuff happens, like, oh, I'm going to give mom, here's a card and call a number. That's not what I'm talking about. Like, we really need to be able to bring some real intervention to some of these families, to some of these kids where they are at. And I would prefer that type of thing to have to be mandatory. You don't have to sit in juvenile, but you will do this. You will follow up with this organization. And if you don't, you will. I mean, we're not taking the fun out of this. And I mean, my God, we're not even giving these kids a stern talking to. Like, most of the time, they're back on the street before the report's even done. And it's a serious public safety issue. It's way too serious for us to try and not figure out more things to do. Yeah. Consent decree and MDHR. Please talk about the steps that the city and MPD are doing to comply with the settlement agreement between the Minnesota Department of Human Rights and the city and MPD. So the settlement agreement is a long document with a number of paragraphs that require, dozens of paragraphs that require certain reforms to be conducted in the police department. It's been filed in court. There's a judge that's been assigned. But it hasn't yet been officially entered. So technically, we're still not at day zero. But obviously, there's been a lot of work that's been happening in the city attorney's office and in the police department to enact a number of these reforms. What you will see publicly, once this does become official, we're going to have a number of community meetings around the city. Where we will be presenting and soliciting feedback on the topics within the settlement agreement. So the settlement agreement is mirrored off of federal consent decrees that have happened around the country, and it focuses on stop, search, and arrest practices, the use of force, bias in policing, disparate outcomes in policing, and all of those types of things that people talk about as being wrong with policing in the U.S. today. So the city and the police department, we are hiring some civilian staff to help support the implementation work, and the city attorney's office is also dedicating some staff to help support this work. So largely what that will look like is there will be spaces for public input, public comment, so that the community can try and have its fingerprints on these policies and practices going forward. And then internally, there will be, I think, 60 additional hours of training for our officers each year around all of these topics. And that training is required to be really adult-based learning, not a lecture and a PowerPoint kind of thing, but realistic training, scenario-based training, so that our officers are better supported to understand, how to apply some of these policies in real time. I don't think that the Minneapolis Police Department was lacking in policies, to ensure that actions were legal and justified. I think the reality is a lot of times policy did not match the reality on the street. So the settlement agreement is providing for additional training, additional support, and actually other protections to ensure officer health and wellness, which is very good. But the end goal is to try and ensure that our values, that what we say in policy is actually what community experiences on the street. And to me, one, I've been through this before. I've been through the consent decree process. And two, I'm not going to be limited to what the lawyers wrote on that piece of paper. We are going to be working to change the culture of the agency. So that means whatever little things that I can also see as being problematic, we are going to change them. And we're going to be looking at what officers are doing every single day. And we're going to try and reward the officers whose behaviors are reflective of community values and lift them up and publicly reward them within the department. And I'm going to do everything I can to hold officers accountable quickly when their behavior steps outside that. So I think the consent decree and settlement agreements, those are legal documents that require certain things that you ultimately have to prove to an independent monitor that the city has done these things to near perfection. Which is like an official legal process. But the bigger thing for me is I want each year as we go forward, one, I want us to have fewer victims of serious crime. But two, each year I want there to be more and more people in Minneapolis who feel like they can trust the police. More and more people who feel like they've had better experiences with the police. More and more people who have better faith that we will have everyone's backs in this city. And that we will be the police for everyone. Whether you like us or not, whether you agree with us or not, whoever people are. And that's where we're trying to get to, not just compliance with this legal document. We want to be in that type of space where people have more and more confidence for us and we are more and more effective at what we're supposed to be doing. My wife always makes fun of me because the more I keep doing this, she'll say, "You need glasses too." I'm like, okay. Could you explain how the changes in MPD management structure you have suggested will help make the department better? So I've gone to the state and I've asked the Senate to eliminate a law from 1961 that applies specifically to Minneapolis. So for some reason, the Minnesota legislature passed a law in 1961 that applies only to the city of Minneapolis and says the city of Minneapolis cannot have more than 3 deputy chiefs. So I've asked the Minnesota legislature, and the senator I spoke to actually was just in a random conversation with him and was saying how there's all these ridiculous laws on statute that limit things based on numbers that make no sense and how he likes to get rid of them. Well, I got one for you right here. And thankfully he took it for us. So the way the structure is now, there's a deputy chief over patrol, a deputy chief over investigations, and then a deputy chief over everything else. Right, so all of the internal affairs stuff, training, administrative functions, grants, all those types of things, all fall under one person. Structurally, what's like obvious to me as an outsider, a lot of what we need, a lot of what is mandated by federal consent decrees, by the settlement agreement, requires accountability. And in order to have accountability, in order to have supervision, you have to have people to get that done. And if you look at just by the numbers, the way the police department is set up now, the bottom 2 ranks are very heavy. I mean, a paramilitary organization should kind of look like this. As you go up, there should be some rationale and reasoning behind as you go up gradually and so on. But the way it kind of looks right now, it's very heavy in the officer and sergeant ranks, and then there's just very few of everybody else. There's very few lieutenants, very few commanders, very few inspectors, and deputy chiefs. So the way I think we should be doing things, if we're serious about getting back to our basic mission, which is, again, focusing on the operational issues, focusing on having fewer victims of crime, and also focusing on earning trust. Building trust where we haven't had it before. And that's how I want to structure the department. I want us to be structured in accordance with our mission and not in accordance with the bureaucracy that we've always had. So I have asked for and gotten permission from the city council to have a second assistant chief. So I will appoint an assistant chief to oversee all of the operational issues. That's the law enforcement stuff. Patrol, investigations, getting fewer victims of crime. And then on the other side, the earning trust, I need an assistant chief to help me manage all of those types of things. And under that, what I wanted additional deputy chiefs for is I think we need a deputy chief to supervise just internal affairs. I think internal affairs is so important that it deserves and should have a person at that level overseeing it. I also believe that constitutional policing and police reform is so important that we should have a deputy chief overseeing that. Because I think if we're going to go out politically and say things that, yeah, we think holding officers accountable is important, yeah, internal affairs is important, yeah, the consent decree is important, but if we have a structure that shows it's really not because the people who do this are down here, we're not serious about this. So that's why I've added those positions. And actually the deputy chiefs over internal affairs and the consent decree work, those positions cannot be added until the legislature repeals that law from 1961, which I think will happen soon. But once that does, I will go back to council to ask to add someone to oversee specifically internal affairs and then someone to oversee specifically constitutional policing and reform work. So that's why I see it that way, because I think we have to, if we're serious about actually making these changes, we need to have an organization that's structured in that way, that shows that those functions are important in what we do. So this is the Newark consent decree. Could you give us some specifics about the change in police behaviors before and after the decree in Newark? So I can tell you my personal experience. And there's a lot of, there's even stuff you could look up online. When the mayor put me in charge of the consent decree process in Newark, it was about a little over a year into it. And it was a total disaster. We hadn't accomplished anything. And people in the community, were up in arms. Like, people were mad for decades at the police department in Newark. And no one internally believed any of this stuff would work. So what it looked like initially is I had to start off going to town hall meetings. Like I was mentioning before, I'm gonna do that here too. And people who came, folks were activists and people who, protested the police, in some cases literally for decades, would come, and I would just stand there and get yelled at for a couple hours, and I didn't even know what people were yelling at half the time because there's just so much anger and frustration in the room. But on the community side, what I learned is the community can tell who's for real and who's not, who's serious and genuine, sincere, and who's not. And just by simply coming back repeatedly, began to earn some trust, and people saw that we were serious in what we were doing. Fast forward to, I then, I retired from the police department in Newark before I came here, and I had a retirement party, and the majority of the people at the retirement party were activists and people who protested the police. It was like a Saturday Night Live episode or something. It was great. And internally in the police department, oh my God, I remember just these arguments with captains and people in charge in the police department that were just saying, "You're gonna get a cop killed," because of some of the basic stuff, the requirements that we're making that are just the same things that we're gonna do here and everywhere else. So there was just a lot of resistance internally. But I think what folks started to understand, they learned it there, I think a little bit harder, I think people here understand it better, is that, one, the training and the support that these things provide are good. They're good for the officers, and they're helpful in terms of getting better results for community. And I think that's pretty well documented. If you would look up, you could look up, there's plenty of stories and examples that you could see. Don't take it from me, take it from what people in community would say has happened there. There's other, tangible statistics you could look at that are outside of police statistics, because I know people always question statistics that are kept just by police. So you could look at the 4 or 5 years prior to when we started really getting into this work, and look at the number of police brutality lawsuits filed and the amount of payouts for police brutality, 4 or 5 years prior versus the 4 or 5 years post. And you would see, I mean, the last time I did it when I was there, I think it was close to like a 90% decrease in the amount of payouts, and then a very significant decrease in the amount of claims filed. So that's real, and that's not this, those are just simply facts and that happened, you know, in time with the decree. But other things happened there that, again, the context is different there than it is in Minneapolis, so it's not directly comparable. But I think in general, those are some types of things that we should expect to see here. We should expect to have fewer complaints around you know, improper force and those types of things. We should expect to be, as taxpayers and as residents of the city, to be paying less for settlements. We should expect that there would be fewer claims of police brutality, fewer lawsuits filed against us. Those are things we should expect to happen. And I think all of us here should expect, again, some signs that a year from now, 2 years from now, like progressively, that we will feel more confident in the work being done by the police department. Great. You're up next. All right. What is it about policing in America that has brought us to this place? Wow. Where we need, I just need help with one word. Okay, what is it about policing in America that has brought us to this place where we need court-supervised programs to get the public safety that both the police and the community want? I think there's a lot to that. I think there's just, we have to recognize that, you know, well, first, we cannot have public safety without involvement of the community, of the public, right? So that is a very critical and integral part of what we're doing, and that's something that I think policing has failed at in the past. But we have to recognize that the police are just one piece of what is involved in this overall, I don't like calling it a system, because if I call it the justice system, you would think there's some rationality and order about how it works, and it isn't. I mean, it's just, I think that's the answer to this question. I think that there's so many places where the system does not work smoothly, that we're not able to always connect people with the resources that they need, because the way things are set up, they're very siloed in government. You know, the city has certain resources, but we can't necessarily access things at the county or even be aware of some different things that might be going on in other places. And I think sometimes, you know, programs and things are created, but you have to be able to get through a certain gateway if you're a person in need of services. And the police department are not necessarily the best people to help refer people, to even just be aware of different things that are out there. So I do think when we are aware of problems that we see recurring, and that we are aware that we are coming into contact, like I said, with, you know, young people in particular that really need some intensive intervention, we have to try and find places, try and find ways to step in where family might not be able to, where the community may not be able to hold and provide, you know, the support that is really needed. And I just think, I just think in general, I think people think of public safety too often as just the police. Policing is a service. It is often the service of last resort, and people look at us as law enforcement. But our job is not just law enforcement. Our job is much more as a service that people need. But I think I think the system in general does not function as rationally as we would think, and we need to try and find ways to help connect people where we can. Yeah. Switch the inspector now? Or? Yeah. All right. I'm off the hook. Inspector Blackwell's up.
Thank you.
Well, hi, everybody. Katie Blackwell. I think I've met some of you, and I see a lot of familiar faces in here. Thank you for having us tonight. So specifically, these questions are related to the 5th Precinct, and if some of you are not familiar with the 5th Precinct, we have 20 neighborhoods in the southwest quarter of the city. And so what is my plan to address crime in this neighborhood, especially along the Nicollet Avenue corridor, which is one of our #1 priorities all the time, especially right over here. So it's a great question. I meet with the businesses, or at least communicate with them. I have a meeting coming up with them next week. And so one thing that we're doing is we've, especially recently, in light of recent gun violence and even a homicide a few weeks, 2-3 weeks ago, we have put officers over there, and we are monitoring that area constantly. We have portable cameras that we were able to place. Last year we had a permanent camera that we put right at 19th and Nicollet. And then we also put a portable camera over at 19th and First Avenue. And this year last year we came together with Metro Transit PD to put additional portable cameras up, but we got the one up at 18th and First Avenue. I think the biggest thing is visibility is great, but we all know that when a squad car is sitting there, crime just bubbles out down Nicollet. And so Inspector Billy Peterson and myself, he's the 1st precinct inspector, we are constantly collaborating. Because when I say I'm going to squeeze over here at 18th and Nicollet hard, that means it's going to bubble out probably over there or in their surrounding neighborhoods. So with that, we rely a lot on our specialty teams. The gun investigator unit is really my heroes right now, and our community response team, because while my officers are doing directed patrols or they're answering all these 911 calls, they are going out after the top offenders, and they're doing a lot of investigative work that takes the small percentage usually that is doing the majority of these crimes off the street. It's not foolproof. We're continuing to work on it and keeping an eye on this Nicollet corridor, along with the Operation Endeavor, with the Nicollet Mall Beats going downtown. So we are sharing, under the operation of our Endeavor has Guardian Beats, and that's all hands on deck. So it's your investigators and your trainers and different specialty teams that have to work one extra day a month. And they come in and they basically meet, and there's 5 different precincts, right? So they might start all downtown, or depending on where the crime patterns go, they usually break up to the precinct. And as a precinct commander, I can direct those Guardian Beats where I want them to go. And it's generally the same areas. We look at crime data daily. We brief it to the chief weekly, and we better have serious answers for him. Otherwise, he's going to be calling me left and right on it. But and then obviously one thing is, besides the Nicollet Mall, a lot of things that we see is sometimes I don't know, we have 20 neighborhoods, so sometimes I don't know of some situations that might arise even around the neighborhoods. We have a lot of apartment buildings, we have a lot of housing, we have a lot of businesses, and so sometimes I don't know if there's a problem because I'm looking at the crime patterns, and if people aren't calling 911, I'm not capturing that in the system. Sometimes people will inundate 311, which I can't see. So I do appreciate when communities come together, especially between the 18th and 19th and Nicollet and down the corridor, and get a hold of me saying, it's not just a problem here, but there's graffiti, there's all these things going on. And they work as a neighborhood association to communicate with me. And I really appreciate the community helping me out in those little hot spots that pop up from time to time. And then it says, what are the particular issues facing the 5th precinct? None. We're perfect. Every other precinct, no. So the biggest issues that we're grappling with is, obviously, gun violence is one of our most significant issues. And you heard Chief O'Hara say that robberies are down, but it's not foolproof, right? We still have them. And this last weekend, we did see an uptick in robberies this weekend, which we jump on with robbery suppression details, our gun violence teams, our investigator units. But one thing we're seeing is that it is not just in the 5th precinct or the city of Minneapolis, it is bubbling out in the metro. And that's what we saw starting back in 2021. And these are very complex issues when the robberies, because it is like finding a needle in a haystack at times, because they will hit way down south, and a little while later they might hit in another precinct and bounce back here, and while our cops are going over there, they're hitting somewhere else. And so what we got better at was not only collaborating with metro-wide agencies and relying on our partners, like the State Patrol, Hennepin County Sheriff's Office, Metro Transit, U of MPD has also assisted us, and then all of our specialty partners in investigations. But we have gotten better at trying to jump, by pulling these guardian beats and extra patrols right over to the hot zones where they start sparking up. But we really were successful was when community members, when we could put out an alert, our crime prevention specialists in that neighborhood, when we started seeing 1 or 2 or 3 pop up, is to reach out to that neighborhood association to tell the block. And then we started getting like 911 calls. Community members were, not this last weekend, it didn't happen so quickly, but in the past when these started popping up the way they did, when we were having 72 across the city a couple years ago, if you were from around here, it was pretty bad. So we relied heavily on community members. And then our state patrol partners that could get the helicopter up in the air. Because car chases are so incredibly dangerous. It's not that we won't chase vehicles, but there comes a point where just the other day they were chasing a carjacking vehicle, and it was going to a school zone in the morning. So rightfully so, the cops canceled that chase, they terminated that chase immediately, and we're relying now on investigative work, which takes time. I wish we were CSI and we could get results in hours. I really wish that, but it's not the case, even though our forensic crime lab is wonderful. But it takes time when we get these vehicles, we process these vehicles for DNA, all these extra things, and it takes time to get search warrants for cell phones and TikTok and all these other things. But in the end, when we have a solid case with the investigators, that's when we can, again, go after that small percentage that's usually doing these wide amount of crimes. So I think that was, am I still on the hot seat? I think Gators, did you have a question? Is that for Deputy Chief?
This is just a follow-up on if we have camera footage. Is there a way?
Oh, okay. So is there a process to submit ring and other camera footage audio to the PD? And or join together community individual with PD with shot detection? Okay, so I'll touch on the first one. Is there a process to submit ring cameras? And generally what happens is we have a link in the city, and you can Google this, or I can send it out to the neighborhood association or even Ellen, but you can register your ring or surveillance camera, and it's really beneficial. We're not coming in and saying we want to see your cameras and view everything. That's not what it is. It's if something happens in your neighborhood, an investigator can come in and they can pull up this screen and they go, look at all these ring cameras, and then who do I contact? And they'll start emailing and phone calling to make that investigation go quicker. So if you Google how to register my camera in the city of Minneapolis, is generally the best and easiest way to do it. If not, I'll make sure we get crime prevention specialist Jennifer Wiseman in the 5th precinct, or we'll direct you to the right precinct. We can work that out. And then is there a way to join together community individual with the police department with shot detection? So I'm not really understanding the question.
Just the first part.
Oh, okay.
So you've answered.
This says call your mom. No. That was more of my mental note I said out loud.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
I'm gonna put you on the
Give him the hard one.
This one says, does the chief really work out as much as it looks like he does? I don't write these people. I was obviously a joke. And he does work out a lot. I was told to, once again.
well, if you have anything you want to say.
Oh,
but
I
also,
have a lot.
the other one is, why should someone want to work for Minneapolis Police Department?
Answer the question with a question. Why wouldn't you? The great thing about our department, and I'm a big advocate of it, first off, I'll say, ever since I was a little kid, I wanted to be a law enforcement officer. When I was younger, grew up in an area where, and I'm not from the state of Minnesota, I'm from the state of Ohio. A lot of jealousy I can see in your eyes. Where I grew up, I had a law enforcement officer actually in my neighborhood. So I followed him around. I was that annoying kid who just followed him around all day long and asked a bunch of questions. But what I learned from him was that he listened to a lot of people. And I don't remember him making arrests. I just remember him talking to a lot of people. I remember some disputes taking place in the neighborhood, but it always seemed to get worked out. Now, I do remember people going to jail, but he wasn't the one who took them to jail. But the thing is that I learned that first off, in any police department, what you need to do as a police officer is learn that it's not your police department. And here in the Minneapolis Police Department, we understand that it's your police department, it's not our police department. So what we need to do is take our experiences, our education, and try to take your input and listen to you and hear you and what you want from service from our police department. So once we understand that, which we've definitely learned since 2020, May 25th, is that we listen to you, you tell us what you want from your police department, what type of service you want from your police department, and what type of people you want giving you that service on your police department. And that's what we try very hard to do. There are many times where, and you can see our police chief is very passionate when he speaks. And that's every day because he really cares. He really truly cares about the community, and he cares about this police department and what it's going to look like. And the thing is that as in my bureau, which is the Community Engagement and Outreach Bureau, is just that, is recruitment. And with recruitment, I try to tell our officers while they're out recruiting is that the type of people we want on our police department are people with good character, people who have a willingness to serve, and people who understand first and foremost that you listen. You listen to your community members first. Get out of those steel cages, which are squad cars, and go out and start talking to people. And that's one thing that I learned 29-ish years ago on the police department was that, and I see one of our former chiefs back there, is that I was told by that generation that, you know what, you park that steel cage and you get out of it and you walk around and you go and introduce yourself to the businesses. If you see people out in their homes sitting on the porch, you get out, you start talking to them. Let them get to understand and know you and understand that if something goes wrong in the neighborhood, they will come up to you and approach you. But 99% of your day is not going to be arresting people. It's going to be talking to each other. So when it comes to our police department, we're looking to definitely make that change. We've gotten away from it, and the chief wasn't here then, but he's recognized it, and sometimes it takes an outsider to come in and go, wow, you guys are doing this a little bit differently than probably when you first started. So we're going to get you back on track. And the thing is that we do not get out as much as we need to, and we need to do that. And in order for us to want people to be a part of our police department, they need to see the change. They want to see the change within us that we are telling people we're going to do. So regardless of a consent agreement, regardless of our policies, which are about as thick as they get, it comes from inside that person. And those are the people we're looking for. And when a person comes in, and this is what they do, I'll tell you, I sit there with the chief on many occasions, and I see these new recruits come in, or candidates come in, and I ask, well, why would you want to be a Minneapolis police officer? And that's a true question. And many of them say, I want to be a Minneapolis police officer because I see the direction this department's going. And what do you mean by that? The follow-up. And he's sitting right there. He's very passionate about it, and he wants to make sure that everyone knows that. And if you ask any of our officers if they've seen the chief lately, 1, 2 in the morning. I wake up sometimes at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I just can't sleep, so I get to my computer or I get right on my cell phone and I'll answer a few emails that'll put me to sleep. And sure enough, if he has not been up for, until 2 in the morning, and I know he gets up very early and goes and works out. So 3 hours a night, if you guys are familiar with Jay Leno, the rumor was that he got about 3-4 hours a night of sleep. So yeah, he's definitely committed to this task. But the thing is that sometimes you have to show what you want people to be. And that's why we do what we do, and that's what we try to show people to engage them and wanting to be a Minneapolis police officer. So I don't see, once people start to understand and see the change that they want to see, I think most people will say, yeah, I want a part of that. I want to be a part of that mission. I want to be a part of that change. And a lot of the young people are starting to see that very early on in this process of change in our Minneapolis Police Department. So, thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much. This has been an important night, and I look forward to working with all of you as we go forward with the police department and make our city better. Thank you.